Good morning, everyone. My name is Diana Fox-Carney, and I'm delighted to be the host of this series on Building Back Better. I know people are still joining, but we're going to get going because we have a packed agenda today to talk about building innovation in the energy sector. Obviously, this is critical to the post-COVID recovery. It's critical to the economy of Canada throughout. And I think it's interesting that we're hosting this webinar today on the day that the International Energy Agency has flagged that there has been an unprecedented $400 billion fall in investment in energy systems this year. They thought that there was going to be an actual increase in investment this year, and there's been a contraction by 20% in the past few months. So this is a moving target, this space, and we have a fantastic panel here to discuss it today. We're going to be very busy. We do encourage your questions and comments. This is a collaborative exercise of trying to get to the right answers. We may not have time to answer all of them in real time, but we are very grateful to them, and we'll think about them afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to the Minister of Natural Resources, Seamus O'Regan, to welcome the panel today. I think the Minister remains muted. Are you with us? Ah. Well, maybe, Toby, I'm going to pass to you then, Toby, and then we can bring the Minister in afterwards, if that works.
That sounds good. Thanks, Diane, and welcome everyone for the sixth segment in this Building Back Better with the Green Recovery Series. We saved fueling innovation in the energy sector for the last one for a good reason. It's really where the rubber hits the road. And for me, it's also personal. Although I live in Toronto now, I was raised an Alberta boy. And so I care a lot about what happens there and in other resource-rich provinces as well. And I think one of the perhaps silver linings of this COVID crisis is it's given us a bit of an opportunity to step back from what has been a bit of a painful and polarized discussion in the past few years and really take stock of the magnitude of the opportunity that is staring us in the face in terms of being a global leading supplier of zero carbon commodities. And I think with the unprecedented surge in public investment we're expecting from the federal government, which is one of the few actors left with the ability to take on the risk and the capital to deploy for research and development and disruptive commercialization of new technologies to tap into these resources that we have an abundant supply and competitive advantage for. I'm hopeful that our federal government will show leadership, has been its want, and is its mandate. And I'm looking forward to the discussion here with everybody today. So thank you for joining.
Fantastic. Thank you, Toby. We'll now hopefully bring in the Minister for his welcome. Is Minister O'Regan on the line? Okay, I'm sorry about that. We seem to have lost him again, so apologies. I think we don't have time to wait at the moment, but should he come in, we will bring him in at a later stage. I will then pass to Celine Back, who's President of Analytica Advisors, who's going to lay out our general thinking in this area before we get to discussion. Thank you, Celine.
Well, thanks very much, Diana. Like Toby, I have a strong connection to Alberta. I'm very proud with Sarah Hastings-Simon to be a Director of Emissions Reduction Alberta, and delighted that Steve MacDonald is able to join us here today. So thank you all for having joined us in this sixth webinar, Corporate Nights Build Back Better series, and it's great to be together in spirit. As you know, we've been working hard these past weeks to build strong proposals to support Canada's commitment to net zero emissions by 2050, and as we build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic. We've made sector proposals that were intended to push the boundaries, including 3 areas directly under the leadership of Minister O'Regan. As we know, we live in extraordinary times, and we've taken to heart the Eisenhower admonition: when you can't solve a problem, make it bigger. So we've proposed strategic paths for the public sector to act in ways that it has not done before to enable a 2/3 decline in carbon emissions from our homes and workplaces, while providing career opportunities to 230,000 people And we've established a pathway for the full decarbonization of Canada's electricity grid by 2030, which would attract $85 billion of private sector investment in renewable energy into the sun and wind belts of Western Canada. We've also proposed infrastructure that would support a shift to 50% of new automobile sales being electric vehicles in just a few short years. So we've pushed beyond the tried and the true. And we hope that you'll forgive us, Mr. O'Regan, for these vigorous proposals that do stand up economically for oil-producing provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. These proposals generate 140,000 full-time jobs over a 10-year recovery period based on $200 billion in investments. All combined, the lion's share of this activity would be in Alberta, about $140 billion of investment and 100,000 full-time jobs.
Here we are.
Hello. But today, Mr. Regan, thanks for joining us. Well, perhaps I'll just finish up quickly. So today we're taking a different path with a proposal which is a return to a tried and tested approach, one that's been proven in Alberta and that has delivered so much to all Canadians. On the basis of $140 billion investment in today's dollars, the Alberta Oil Sands Technology Research Authority, AOSTRA, to those familiar with it, led to the successful commercialization of the oil sands, a resource which has helped unlock $313 billion of investment into companies which at their peak employed 400,000 people directly or indirectly and provided $800 billion in annual revenues to government. According to the research conducted by Sarah Hastings-Simon, who has joined us today, AOSTRA was characterized by three important qualities. It had the right goal by targeting disruptive innovation that went beyond immediate commercial interests. It had the right structure through the full backing of long-term funding from the government, but independently delivered. And it had the right scale to realize the goal while taking into account the capacity of people, as well as available natural capital and industrial infrastructure. And that's why we're proposing that the federal government create a $25 billion energy innovation fund. The fund would be for zero carbon technologies such as green hydrogen, geothermal, and carbon fiber as examples. The $25 billion energy innovation fund would reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands by about 23 billion tons by 2030, and from oil and gas more generally as zero carbon technologies are deployed in Canada. And it would leverage $100 billion in total investment, including private sector funds. And most importantly, it would catapult Canada to be a supplier of choice for $120 billion annually of zero carbon commodities by 2030. And in the process, it would create 500,000 person years of employment by 2030. The fund would be fully endowed to insulate it from changing political priorities and would take advantage of today's very low interest rates. The Energy Innovation Fund learns from AOSTRA in another key dimension, and that is that the fund would invest 100% of the requirements for R&D to the point of deployment. And this would confer IP ownership to the fund for any research that it would finance. Industry co-investors would have the right to use, but not own the IP. And the fund would be designed to deliver a legacy to Canadians, just as AOSTRA did. Back to you, Diana, and to Minister Regan and our experts and panelists today.
Thank you very much, Celine. Minister, I'd love to bring you in now. You've heard a little bit of the proposals, but I'd love to bring you in just for a general welcome and a word on your thinking at the moment.
Okay. Everybody can hear me?
We can indeed.
Okay, good. I don't take anything for granted these days. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I've been a big fan of corporate nights for a long time. I think you've been well ahead of the curve, I think, in many respects, not only in pointing out the imperative of climate change, but also the imperative of business working closely in order to make it happen, and I think pointing out what a leader Canada can be. So I'm deeply appreciative of the invitation. And I'll have to leave early, but you know, you're probably used to hearing this from ministers now. We've reached an agreement with the other parties, so question period is back, which means I've got to leave to show up for the virtual House of Commons. So my apologies, frankly, I would have liked to have been here all day, and I know members of my staff will be. I think, you know, if I could just go on and just give you a bit of a, you know, where I see things. I think first of all, it has to be noted that, you know, we've made a commitment now that Canada will not exceed, will not just exceed, I think it's 2030 Paris agreements, but that we will reach net zero by 2050. And I think that that's very important. I mean, that makes us part now of 77 countries around the world, a growing number of corporations. Very proud of the fact that my province yesterday announced it would be making a commitment to net zero, and as one of the 3 oil producing provinces in this country, I think that that's important. And for its part, you know, we put a price on pollution. We're phasing out coal-powered electricity, and we are making, and we will continue to make, particularly now, some generational investments in clean energy and new technologies, in green infrastructure. NRCan, my department, we are supporting over 900 clean technology projects right across the country, nearly $1 billion in clean tech initiatives. That's now. You know, we all, I think, fully appreciate that that may be ramping up as we come out of COVID-19. I mean, the total value of those projects, you know, generally runs around 4 times that. We've invested more than $3 billion since 2017 in clean energy capture, carbon storage, wind, solar power, alternative fuels, energy storage, smart grids, energy efficiency. You know, I'll save you all the details, but one thing I always make sure that I mention, and to allow it to sink in, is that we are the fourth largest oil producing nation on the earth right now, 4th largest. We are behind the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. We are ahead of Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. And I say that not to kind of entrench ourselves and say, oh, you know, we're an oil country. There's a responsibility that comes with that. I mean, I think we are a country that is blessed with a bounty of natural resource wealth, and an enviable quality of life as a result. And how we meet the urgency of combating climate change is the challenge of our age. With that in mind, that we are a natural resource country, that there is no democracy on the planet that is as blessed with a wealth of natural resources as we are. And importantly, you say both of those things, democracy and wealth of natural resources. Nobody else is dealing with this on the level that we are. So we need a plan to reach net zero by 2050. Right now, we do not have one. We are working very hard on it. Oil and gas production is an essential component of our national economy in 2020. It will continue to be an essential component of our national economy in 2025 and in 2030. In fact, I think I was just told my video's not on. Sorry, guys. I don't know how that happened. Because it says it is. Can you see me?
We can see you now.
We can see you now. Yeah, we appreciate you turning it back on.
I don't know what happened there. Okay. Am I still on?
You've gone off now.
Okay. I think in every scenario under the Paris Accord, fossil fuels remains a necessity for the short and the medium terms. There's no getting around it. Recognizing the importance of oil and gas to our current national economy doesn't mean that we hide from the reality of climate change. It just means we need to have a plan. And I think it's very important to understand a few things. I think that the plan has to be honest, and that we have to confront the reality of our economy. I always say that does not hinder us, though, from bold moves. It just means that we have to make smart ones. You know, there comes a time when I make these points about kind of the present state of our national economy and how much we, still are very much hewers of wood and drawers of water. Although those are some of the, I think, most high value and high tech jobs in the country. As much as people think natural resources is some sort of retrograde thing, it is not. It is. Most of these positions are very well paid, very high value. It just means that we are at that point now where we are making the necessary compromises in order to put these things in place. In a democracy, it means that we have to maintain a critical mass of people. It means that we have to have people on board. It means that we have to ensure that we keep people on side and that they understand that transition, while it does mean change, it is not a scary thing. It is actually something that will guarantee our future prosperity. I have said to many of my provincial colleagues and repeated to the Premier, and he agreed in his commitment to net zero here in Newfoundland and Labrador, that net zero is not just a plan for our environment, it is a plan for our economic competitiveness. And increasingly, we know that's where markets are going. Norvège, of course, the Norwegian sovereign fund. Before that, it was BlackRock. In between there was Sweden and its sovereign fund. Investments are changing. Mark Carney and what he's been saying for the past couple of years, he's right. And ultimately, you follow the money. And the money is increasingly steering us towards net zero solutions. And companies are looking for net zero solutions. Our biggest fear, and I've said this, I attended Globe, and I think some of you were there, and I gave a speech about the importance of keeping every region in this country on side, the importance of not leaving workers behind, but making sure that they are part of this transition. And I gave that speech, and made the point, that there was no way that we were reaching net zero without including Alberta, without including our oil and gas industry. You can model it out any way you want. There is no way you're getting to net zero without that very important province, and without including oil and gas. Now, the next day after Globe, I flew and co-hosted with the Minister of Energy, co-hosted a clean tech summit with oil and gas. All the senior execs were there, did that in Calgary. And I said, there will not be a viable oil industry in this country unless we make commitments to net zero. That's the flip side. And at that time, BlackRock had just made its decisions and they were reeling from that. But the biggest concern was that Canadian oil and gas, Canadian energy, becomes a box to check. That for investment houses, it becomes that box to check. That okay, well, the portfolio manager looks down the table and says, "What are we doing about climate change? Oh, we're writing off Canadian oil. We're no longer investing in Canadian oil." We're seeing that happen. So what's on the other side of that ledger? What's the other box to check? That increasingly for a lot of investors is net zero, seeing a commitment to net zero. So it is an imperative, I think, for our economy from an economic point of view that we get on board with this. And when that happens and money starts flowing into those areas, I think that we are going to see some significant investments in this country. And I think that is very much to our advantage. So I'll stop there. I waxed on a little long, and my apologies. But it is very important that we are honest, I think, with Canadians about change, about pace of change, and about our commitments to making sure that we're not leaving people behind. We're not leaving regions behind. I think it's very important that we're thorough, that we see this through, and I think it's important that we're bold. And I think that there's an incredible amount of potential in this country. I think that we're at a point where people recognize its importance, and I know that industry and government, I think there's a great willingness to start looking at significant investments we could be making at this juncture in order to prepare us for 2030 and for 2050.
Thank you so much for being with us, Minister. We really appreciate that, and we will be feeding back our thoughts. We're delighted to hear that you are ready to be bold, and that you're focused on net zero, because there's a lot that needs to be done in the next 30 years. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to pass over now, get going with the panel. We're many and we have a short period of time. But actually, I wanted to start with Chad Park from the Energy Futures Lab, just to pick up on the point that the Minister made there about the structure of the conversation that we need to have moving forward. And I know you've been thinking about this a lot, Chad.
Thank you very much. Yes. And thank you for the opportunity. I think the first thing I want to say is that there is a huge network of people in Alberta specifically who are ready and active and engaged in finding the solutions. Clean tech entrepreneurs, oil and gas organizations, and people from a whole diversity of backgrounds. And we've been fortunate with the Energy Futures Lab to be connected to a lot of them, and several of the partners of the lab are represented in this panel as well. And the thing that we've learned there is that the polarization on these issues represents a problem that in achieving any objectives, and that while technology innovation is critical in solving these problems, and the deployment of technologies is of course a big part of the solution, that social innovation needs to be just as prominent as technological innovation. And you know, there's a real opportunity there to create new forms of or new pathways, I guess, to the solutions by careful attention to cultivating trust and social capital among diverse actors in the system. And when we do that, we can find breakthrough opportunities. We've found that the elephant in the room in these conversations is often disagreement about the future of fossil fuels for the future of Canadian economy, which is maybe obvious, but what we have also found is that there's the potential for common ground when we kind of dive deep into that and understand that there could be a role for hydrocarbons in the transition and in the future of a low carbon future. And we refer to that as future fit hydrocarbons. And I think some of the speakers that are going to come, Dan Wicklum and others, are probably going to talk about some of the opportunities related to that. So that's what I'll offer up. They're not often the voices that get heard from Alberta, but there's a whole army of people working on solutions in Alberta that are keen to be engaged in this.
Fantastic. I think it's a really constructive, thoughtful start for our conversation today. I'm going to pass now to Sarah Hastings-Simon, who's done a lot of research. She's from the Payne Institute for Public Policy, but she's done a lot of research on AOSTRA, which Celine mentioned. And perhaps you can tell us what we can learn from that initial support of innovation in Alberta.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. And I mean, Celine did a great job, I think, of summarizing some of the main findings from the work looking at the history of government support of innovation. You know, I think first and foremost, it really just makes the case that there is a strong role for government in creating markets and creating industries. And that's not a theoretical, you know, proposition. That's something that's happened in our own backyards. You know, one of the things that was really important in AOSTRA's success and in the provincial government's success in developing the technology for in situ oil sands production was that at the time they took on a pretty bold goal. And, you know, with hindsight, we see it a little bit differently because the oil sands industry has obviously become such a big part of the oil industry writ large. But at the time, this was really seen as a different sort of resource underneath the ground. You know, it was even referred to as alternative energy, interestingly enough. And there's some lessons there, I think, in when we look at the resources that we have, you know, in Alberta and in other natural resource provinces. When we look at the resources that we have, we need to think big and kind of bold beyond those incremental improvements, which are also needed. But we need to make sure that we're also targeting these bigger, longer, you know, seemingly further away type goals. And in order to actually, you know, do that and achieve that, you know, there's a couple of key things that a structure needs, and that's, you know, definitely that independence. You need to walk that fine line of having an organization that's able to pursue its own ideas and really push beyond the sort of shorter term where industry is likely to focus. And AOSTRA did that well. You need to obviously have, you know, the highly qualified people that still know the details and are able to bring in that knowledge. And then one of the other things that I think really contributed to the success that we can learn from is that innovation often comes not from, you know, a bunch of things that are brand new from first principles, but really applying, you know, technologies and ideas that are well established in one field into another. And we saw that, you know, with the development of the in situ resource, really applying, for example, techniques from mining to the oil industry, and really that cross-pollination is where you got a lot of those you know, breakthroughs at the end of the day. And that's not unique to the Astra story. We see that over and over again in innovation. So I think that overall, you know, the history of building up the oil sands industry in Alberta really shows us that there is a role for government, you know, in times like these where we're facing some kind of massive disruption, to step in, to make, you know, fund and really drive those bold innovation research towards creating new industries and economic development for the province.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's obviously not simple. I mean, there is a lot of, there's a lot of social innovation. It's very difficult to get from where we are to where we need to be, even if we can all say nice words about it. And I wondered if now we could just bring in Dan Wicklum, who's CEO of the Transition Accelerator, because I know he's been thinking a lot about how net zero emissions can frame our direction going forward. And really focus the mind on what we have to do, because it's not just more of the same and add a few nice things on top. It is a really different way of thinking about things. Dan?
Yeah, thanks. So the Transition Accelerator is a new organization. We launched about 6 months ago. And what we try to do is take a different framing to emissions reductions. So our framing is that we want to deeply understand transformations and disruptions that are happening and not slow them down, but actually accelerate them, and accelerate them in ways where Canada can win economically. So when we apply this paradigm to the Canadian economy, a couple of things pop out. One of them is the potential to advance a hydrogen economy. And one of the framing issues around hydrogen is really is net zero. Now everyone understands, you know, a Paris net zero commitment. 77 countries have this type of commitment. In Canada, certainly some parts of Canada, you know, we tend to think of that as an election promise or a communication strategy by an individual company. But much of the world is taking this as a necessary objective. And I think increasingly we are doing the same here. But if you really dig into that net zero paradigm, it's remarkably clarifying. I mean, we've been trying to reduce emissions in the world and in Canada for many decades with some success. I think one of the problems is there's so many ways to reduce emissions. We get into these debates, circulated debates about whose technology that we should use or what approach we should use. But if we actually really ground into net zero, that clarifies things, because there's very few ways that you can actually get to net zero. Many technology systems and many companies and their solutions, frankly, drop off the table because they can't be part of a net zero solution. So this is really why it seems like the whole world is doubling and tripling down on hydrogen, using hydrogen as a zero emission fuel, because it is one of the few technology platforms where not only people can make money, but it can actually be a part of a net zero system. So where does that leave Canada? We just happen to be independently benchmarked to be about the cheapest place on the planet to make hydrogen. So if we're looking for a win-win where we can use what the disruptions that are happening in the world, whether they're business model, accelerate them so that we can not only deliver good environmental performance in Canada, but win economically, hydrogen could be a fantastic option for us. So what does that look like? Blue hydrogen, where we take natural gas, and all we're doing when we make blue hydrogen is we're upgrading it. So this is not actually leaving our fossil fuel sector behind. We're just evolving it based on the new competitive forces in the world. So we're taking our natural gas resources anywhere in Canada, upgrading that natural gas into blue hydrogen. Of course, we capture the carbon and we store it. And then we can use that zero emission fuel domestically. But picture Canada where we become the global dominating exporter of this zero emission fuel that the world can't get enough of. So a fundamental paradigm shift from Canada as being carbon intensive part of the problem to global supplier of choice for zero emission fuel that the world can't get enough of. Think of how that would change Canada. You know, we're working with some other groups that in the past have been quite negative on Canada's oil and gas sector. But as soon as they understand that, you know, the current oil and gas sector could pivot and evolve to being a critical part of the problem, we're starting to make remarkable, and I would say new and quite amazing bedfellows where parties in the past that have been pitted against each other based on carbon are now completely aligned with each other and scoping out a future for Canada's oil and gas sector. Just happens to be with blue hydrogen.
Thank you very much, Dan. There's a couple of questions in the panel about blue hydrogen. Obviously, if it's going to be zero carbon, you have to have pretty much 100% carbon capture. At the moment, the rates are usually about 95%, even with good carbon capture. So we've got work to do in that space. There's also possibilities for green hydrogen produced through renewable energy. Let's not get into the technical details. I'm going to pass, I mean, let me just say that hydrogen is the future, I believe, and there's been announcements this week from a variety of Danish companies who are building out, beginning to collaborate to build out the hydrogen industry in Europe. I want to pass now to Mark Little, who's CEO of Suncor, obviously one of the incumbents in the oil industry, and ask him whether, or ask you, Mark, whether net zero is concentrating your mind and how you are responding to all these potential avenues for innovation in your sector.
Great, thanks so much. I appreciate it, and it's nice to be here. I'm probably like, thankfully we're not in all together, because it'd be kind of like, pile on that guy, being the largest oil sands producer in the country. You know, I think Dan actually said it really well, is, you know, this isn't actually about a marketing brochure or a political campaign. This is actually about taking real action and turning it into innovation. As a company, we define our purpose as providing trusted energy that enhances people's lives while caring for each other and the earth. And so all of that drives us around the whole issue about how do you drive down emissions? What are the technologies of the future? Now, I think the great news in all of this, if you go back over the history of the industry, and it's been talked about here around AOSTRA and such, as innovation is at the core of the industry. That is actually what's allowed us to compete in this global market. As was pointed out, there's only 2 democratic nations on the surface of the earth with lots of oil, and we have a lot of it. The challenge is it's heavy and it comes with lots of carbon. But if you go back to the start of the industry in Canada, we used to flare all the gas because nobody even knew what to do with it. And today it's a booming industry of significance within the country. And then we had all of this oil sands resource and we didn't know what to do with it, and we didn't know how to operationalize it. And I'm quite confident I'm the only one on the panel today that's walked underground in the AOSTRA mine and recovered the drilling rig because we didn't know how to drill horizontal wells. And it was, all of this was the birth of the industry. The great thing that is so awesome, I think, about COVID-19, which is, it's hard to attach anything positive to it, but we've seen us come together across political lines, across industries, across geographies in our country to pull together to attack this terrible disease. And I think one of the great opportunities we have is to come together and leverage things like, how do we deal with hydrogen? Trust me, the industry today makes a lot of hydrogen, not the way we want to make it in the future, the blue and the green hydrogen that we've talked about, but we have the skills and technology and know how to handle it safely and the logistics in place. So we're excited about being part of the future. We're involved in things like Enerchem, where we're trying to convert municipal garbage to fuel, and it's in the gasoline pool today, or whether it's converting and trying to do things like LanzaJet, where we're recycling carbon emissions to be able to come up with renewable jet fuel. Exciting opportunities. That's the challenge in front of all of us.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that. I think there will be a great point to bring in Steve MacDonald, who's CEO of Emissions Reduction Alberta, to ask you how it looks from your side and where you think the big opportunities for emissions reduction from the traditional industry are, and the opportunities for innovation for a low carbon future.
Thank you, Diana. Yeah, you know, Emissions Reduction Alberta has really been in the solution space for about 10 years now, and we invest the carbon levy paid by our large final emitters in identifying those clean technologies that drive the outcomes in terms of cutting costs and cutting carbon. We've invested about $500 million in about $4 billion worth of projects so far, and about half of those have been in cleaner oil and gas. There's lots of people on this panel that'll talk about specific technologies. So I thought I'd spend my 3 minutes talking a bit about what are the other pieces of the puzzle that need to be in place to successfully advance the solutions that are needed. And we like to talk about complete solutions, that it's much more than just investing public money and picking the right technology. You need all the pieces in place to make the business case work. We like to say that we need to pick projects that are not just shovel ready, but they're actually shovel worthy. And so what I'm talking about there is things like policy innovation. You need those predictable policies and regulations that are pushing industry and innovators in the right direction. You need innovation in terms of the structures, the partnerships between big companies, like Steve mentioned there, and the innovators to partner and actually drive the sort of ideas from sort of the early stage to scale up in actual deployment. And we need financial innovation, especially in the energy sector, where there's large capital requirements and innovation in the tax system, new debt instruments, green loans, those kinds of projects. And I'd also say we do need what Chad mentioned around that cultural innovation, that we need the behaviors and the beliefs that allow us to take the risks we need to deploy these technologies. And above all, I think we need that shared goal that many have talked about is you can't drive a pathway without the shared understanding of what the final destination is. And, you know, where is that common ground between, you know, oil is dead and we want to be the last barrel produced. And that's something we've learned without that. And how you sequence these pieces and understanding the causes and effects is really important. The last point I'd make is that the issue is emissions. That's the villain, not an industry. And this series has sort of demonstrated that the solutions can come from multiple sources, because every sector is struggling with similar challenges, be it waste heat or industrial process efficiency, water treatment, fuel switching, or carbon capture and storage. And we got to understand that if we focus on what are the problems, and that's the emission, and share those technologies, we'll be very successful. And we also got to remember, we got to work across multiple timescales. We've learned that in emissions reduction in Alberta, that we got to focus on solutions that are addressing doing the same things better around current production. But if there's going to be growth, we also got to identify doing better things, and that's where we're going to hear more comments around hydrogen, like Dan mentioned, carbon utilization, and things like geothermal. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Steve. At this point, I'd like to bring in, sorry, I'm losing my track, but I'd like to bring in Linda Cody, who's the Executive Director of Pembina Institute, who's obviously, you know, most of you will know the work of Pembina and what they do around, certainly around the social space and thinking about the future of these technologies. So Linda, how would you think we best move ahead in this space? You're muted, Linda.
Sorry, I promised myself I wouldn't do that, but I did. Hello, everyone. Well, I'll just pick up on a couple of themes that have already been identified. So I want to back Chad's point about the importance of social innovation here. I think that a lot of the work that we've done at Pembina over the years on polarization around climate and energy issues in Canada indicates that a lot of that polarization is there because the resource sector and its workforce does not clearly see a pathway forward for itself to the clean economy. And I think we're all learning from the pandemic here as we deal with the economic fallout, and the fact that some of that economic fallout is disproportionate on some groups: women, minorities, jobs in the service sector, jobs in the oil and gas sector, that those issues around social and economic inequality and inclusion are coming into greater relief. So I'd just like to make a pitch here for jobs, for the importance of jobs being created from all of the technologies and new policies and ideas that are being discussed on this panel today. I know that people are going to be talking about jobs in clean fuels and heavy duty transportation that uses those fuels. New climate resilient infrastructure will create new jobs, as will the materials that go into those building that infrastructure. Energy storage, decentralized grids, jobs in renewable electricity, but also jobs in reducing the emissions that are not going to be electrified away, as Dan was just talking about, like jobs in hydrogen, drilling in geothermal, methane reduction, monitoring and measuring, carbon capture and storage, new other industrial efficiencies, new jobs in emergency response to extreme weather events, and last but not least, jobs in ecological restoration and new nature-based climate solutions that can help sustain rural communities. So I think these are all part of the equation here as we talk about these net zero technologies and policies. And we have to, I think the challenge before us coming out of the pandemic is to create the confidence in Canadian workers that they can see themselves and their family, they can see a role for them in this decarbonization and transformation that we now have the opportunity to achieve.
Thank you so much, Linda. I think you've brought up two really important issues. One is the jobs piece, which has been at the beginning of each one of these events. We have talked about the number of jobs that might be created, but it's always worth bringing us back to that. You know, we have to focus on how this all looks from the jobs perspective and how this looks and feels to people who've lost their jobs in the current crisis and really are struggling at this moment in time. So thank you for that. The other thing which I think you did very effectively was really gave a sense of the scope of possibilities in this space. I mean, everything is wide open now. Costs, as we know, for renewables have fallen through the floor, but the innovation around new types of fuels, around storage technologies, around different ways to capture carbon, whether it's at source from industry or in biological storage. It's a really exciting time, and we have innovation. We're not yet there, but we have possibilities. So on that note, I'm going to bring in Jeremy Baines, and he's from a company which you may not know, so he can tell us a little bit about it, called Neste, and they are doing something very innovative in this space.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. Neste is the leading producer of renewable diesel. I think we are the largest producer in the world of renewable diesel, made from wastes and residues. And we also provide sustainable circular solutions. And I might like to disagree with some of the comments that have actually been said here today, because by 2040, 70% of light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles will still be running on an internal combustion engine. And although I think it's right that we are looking at what future technology could bring, climate change is not going to wait for the perfect solution to arrive. So we need to do something to decarbonize, reduce those emissions today. And that's where some of these advanced biofuels can play a role today. These are drop-in solutions. They work with existing engines, they work with existing infrastructure. This is technology that we are familiar with, that the oil and gas industry has mastered for decades. So this is something we can do now. And I think therefore, any government action should focus on building these future jobs, not yesterday's jobs. And that means encouraging the development of sustainable, low carbon energy and transport solutions that power our lives. And we need to have that action now. We just can't wait on the someday solution when there is a today solution that works. And Canada, we talked about the abundance of the resources in Canada. Canada is well positioned for these kind of sustainable transitions today. You have those oils, those fats, those greases that can be converted into advanced fuels, that can be put into diesel engines, that can be put into planes. I mean, how we haven't even talked in this discussion about how are we going to decarbonize these hard to abate sectors? There's no electric cable long enough to power a plane. Yeah. So, and these planes will be flying for decades to come. So I think we also need to focus on what can be achieved in the short term, in the medium term, while also thinking about how to create the future world, a future world where there is going to be many different solutions. It'll be a polyfuel world. There are going to be solutions in different niches, in different sectors. And I think therefore good policy action today is so important.
Thank you. I think that it is a valuable reminder that we can't wait for the perfect. We do have to start with where we are and make the best of it. I'd now like to turn to JP Gladu, who, and like you to bring you in to discuss, obviously, the Indigenous concerns in this area. This is an area of conflict, but it is also an area of opportunity. And perhaps you can talk us through your thinking in this area.
Thank you. I mean, there's massive opportunity here. And I think Alberta, as far as the provinces go, has been a leader with regards to Indigenous relations, from a private sector to Indigenous community, Indigenous business relationship. We can see that as far back with Eric Newell, who at the time, 30 plus years ago, was contracting Indigenous communities, who built up the capacity over time to participate, to a couple of years ago signing a massive deal with Suncor in the East Tank project with Mikisew Cree and Fort McKay. I love talking about that example because it's a prime example of how you create partnerships, how you create, more importantly, I think in this country, the certainty. There's a lot of conversations around disruption right now and acceleration. If we put that through the Indigenous lens, all I have to say is Wet'suwet'en, and you get a good picture of what disruption can look like on the LNG project. And that's because there hasn't been a solidified approach between the government, industry, and communities to put down a pathway what our country is going to look like in 40 years from now. And I find myself, I mean, I have a few friends on the line here who've heard this messaging over and over, and I feel like I'm having to keep telling this to Canadians and sharing these stories, and it just doesn't get the pickup. And all due respect to Linda and your comments, I was waiting for the Indigenous portion in the social impacts of our communities that were not mentioned in your remarks, and this is often the case across this country. If we can't start to embed these conversations into everyday meetings like this, when it comes to our effectiveness and our competitiveness globally, we're going to continue to struggle with issues like Wet'suwet'en. So it really gets down to being innovative. And when I think it was Steve was talking about innovative ways of actually creating capacity, like I think what the Premier's done is incredible, creating the $1 billion fund for the Indigenous Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Fund. That's how you're going to power communities. That's how you're going to get more capacity to participate in the jobs, participate as partners, participate in the supply chain. So this just needs to be common conversation within our country. And I don't think there's a better champion, again, to my friend Mark and Suncor has been doing within our Indigenous communities across the country. That's the type of innovation that we need to be doing. That's the type of effort that it takes.
Thank you so much, JP. Terri, Lynn, do you have anything to add to that, what JP has said?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Diana. There's just 3 points that I want to speak about in terms of solutions. One of them being putting a premium on talent and innovation, especially for our younger professionals, including the Indigenous peoples. The recovery needs to be focused on the future and the economic prospects of Canada's young professionals, utilizing their energy, their passion, and their education. Another thing, in terms of private investment, the focus should be on funding to deliver multiple impacts. So we need to optimize the deployment of capital to have multiple impacts being sought, including, a spectrum of economic opportunities, like Indigenous communities. We're talking about local employment, using their ongoing knowledge based. There's regional and Canadian economic development that can happen. There's project and venture earnings and generation of reinvestment for clean growth. We talk about social outcomes, community resilience, improving health outcomes, healthier homes, And then, you know, bringing in the environmental components, so having, you know, carbon and reduced pollution. And another point is just going on about the, onto the Indigenous and local communities being, you know, a critical on-the-ground partners for post-economic recovery, similar to what JD spoke about. You know, if we as a country are going to maximize the local and Indigenous impacts of public and private investment as a core element of the post-COVID economic recovery, not only by doing this will the economic impacts be more substantive, but we'll have a much higher public support, you know, through the Indigenous communities as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's a hugely important piece of this puzzle. I'm going to turn now to Laura Kilcrease, who has the honor of being CEO of Alberta Innovates. Alberta obviously is at the core of many of these discussions. It's not just about Alberta, and you know, we heard from Minister O'Regan at the beginning that Newfoundland has apparently made a net zero commitment today and is also an oil producing province, of course. But tell us a little bit about what the view is from your seat, because Alberta, obviously, you know, there's lots of bitumen there, but there's lots of other possibilities too. There's the scope for geothermal, the scope for solar, there's lots more to be done. So how do you see this whole puzzle going forward?
Thank you, Diana. We in Alberta Innovates are really the innovation engine for the province. And as such, we've worked with many of the people who are on this broadcast today and continue to work with them. I think the whole issue of net zero is going to come from a multitude of innovations that are going to be applied to the market at the same time. It's not going to be any one innovation. It's the collection coming together in a way that makes sense economically, or really to meet our ESG scores and goals in terms of environment and social and government policy. Ultimately, it has to have an economic output that is viable for not just Alberta, but viable very much for Canada as a whole. So today, you know, we've talked about hydrogen, we've talked about the Indigenous funds, we've talked about many different areas, biofuels. We're working all of these, geothermal, carbon capture. In fact, in Alberta, outside of Calgary, we have one of the largest carbon capture plants in the country that we're using for X Prize winners. But today, very briefly, I want to talk to you about bitumen beyond combustion. In other words, I'd like to have you all think about bitumen as a raw material for other materials that would be important. And we believe we can take bitumen today and reduce greenhouse gases by at least 126 megatons per year, just by, instead of burning all of the bitumen, taking the carbon fibers from the bitumen, taking activated carbons from the bitumen, and taking asphalt binders. So let's look with the big one. Big one is carbon fibers. Today, we have an opportunity to take these fibers that have high strength, a great stiffness, a low density, low corrosion rates, and apply them to many of the existing industries as an alternative material, whether that's aircraft or automobiles or other areas. Today, the future market is predicted at $212 billion by 2030 for carbon fibers. And the bitumen we find in Canada is absolutely perfect raw material from which to take those carbon fibers. Second would be the activated carbon. Why is that important? Because it's got very high surface absorption, and we can use this in applications of methane and hydrogen storage that we'll need to undertake, air purification, many other applications. And today, activated carbon is a market that's growing at 13% per year globally. So again, this could be just a mere 15% of our demand from our oil sands could go to produce this activated carbon, 36,000 barrels a day. And this could give us an enormous new product opportunity in the marketplace. And third, the asphalt binders, obviously mainly used for roads today, but asphalt binders are estimated to be about $50 billion annually. You start putting those things together and taking the raw bitumen, and instead of burning it or combusting it, for the making it cleaner by taking the materials out of it, and there are a few other materials, I should say, like vanadium and so forth. We believe we could easily have, in Alberta alone, $84 billion of new markets in new materials that are clean. So I think as we look at this, I'm only bringing BBC up today, bitumen beyond combustion, because we have a wealth of opportunity at this table. But if we look at that and we can save 126 megatons of CO2, and we just still keep burning, as Jeremy has said, some percentage of our bitumen, basically our balance of about 2 million barrels a day, we suddenly have a meaningful market that creates jobs, that meets our ESG scores. And I say this in all honesty, because innovation, as was said earlier, has been at the forefront of what's happened with our oil sands since time immemorial, since AOSTRA, since SAGD, since the diluents that have been developed, and we've been involved in most of those things. So I'll leave you with the BBC. Really, it's the other BBC, Diana. Bitumen beyond combustion, lots of market. And one last point on that is we have the largest single source as raw material in our oil sands that can produce these new materials in North America. This is not an opportunity we should lose in Canada. Thank you for my colleagues here, because I think working together is what's going to be important here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that BBC has probably a slightly brighter future than another one I know. But I'm interested in the activated carbon. So you're saying that can draw down other gases and be stable as a form of carbon storage?
Yes. Yes, absolutely, Diana. So whether it's methane, hydrogen, it can even actually be used in gold purification, metal extracts, water purifications, air filters for gas masks, a number of other areas that it could be used more in if we could produce more of that activated carbon. And that's a nearer term opportunity for using some of our bitumen for.
Fascinating. Now, the one question that's come up a little bit in the chat panel is around LNG. We haven't talked about it, but it is something that people have heard about, know about, and has been promoted by some parts of the industry. I'm not sure who I should be asking actually about LNG. If anyone would like to sort of physically raise their hand and like to come in on LNG. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, so I'm actually just doing some research on the LNG potential, and I think it's important to recognize that, yes, there is a potential for Canada to export LNG, and there are climate benefits, obviously, of displacing coal with natural gas. There's a couple of limitations, of course, though, to keep in mind. So one is, what is the size of that market? And we're looking at two key limiters, one being actually the import capacity from companies that would be purchasing LNG, which, there is a crossover point where the export that is capacity that is planned and under construction will actually exceed that import capacity. The second is the global carbon budget, and that, while LNG is lower emitting than coal, it still does have emissions when burned. And so again, there, as you start to look to the mid-century, you would start to fill up the carbon budget, the global carbon budget, almost exclusively with LNG at a certain point if you really expand that market dramatically. And then the third is more of a geopolitical question, which is, some of the countries that are being targeted for imports, like, for example, China, as well as others, may be reluctant to hand over, a very significant portion of their energy supply to another country. So, overall, I think there's certainly a potential there for some LNG exports, but I think the lifetime of those projects, as well as the total demand, is going to be maybe more limited than some people are considering.
Thank you, Sarah. That actually eats up all our time for today. It's been a really interesting discussion. There's been very rich commentary in the panels, and both a lot of optimism about the kind of solutions that have been proposed, the innovation that abounds in this industry, the near-term and longer-term potential solutions, but also a realistic assessment of really quite limited progress that has been made in some areas thus far. Even though we know what we can do, we haven't always done it. We haven't done the right thing. So I think the hope is that now that COVID does give us, I'm not quite sure how to say it politely, but a kind of kick up the arse to move into a new sphere and not just be incremental in our approaches, but really redefine the energy future for Canada, for the world, to be serious about getting to those net zero targets, not just pay lip service, and figure out how Canada can be part of that. So I'm really grateful to everyone who's attended today. I'm grateful to everyone who's attended for the, there may be some people there who've been here for the past 6 weeks, not just Toby and I. If that's you, thank you for coming. Thank you for all your participation. We do have one final event next week, and that is a wrap up where we can think about bringing all these different ideas together, and we can draw on what you've contributed during these hour-long sessions each week. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye. We did have a poll, and the poll was about the energy future, and I forgot to do it, and I'm not going to do it now. I apologize. Maybe we'll bring that on next week. But thank you so much to all our panelists for taking the time. Thank you to everyone who came, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Goodbye.